So with that, let's dive into our webinar. This is Geonetric's January webinar. We're going to be talking about digital marketing trends. And of course, you know, a little cliche, right? That every year we talk about trends and we think about trends, but we think it's a good way to kick off the year, to sort of look at the things that we've been focused on in all of our different disciplines over the year. We come together and we spend some time talking about like what we're seeing happening in the space and what we see or expect to continue to see here in the year ahead. I, of course, am Ben Dillon. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Geonetric, and we'll be moderating today's conversation. With me today is Tim Lane, our leader of our digital marketing efforts, Ann Kapler, who is a leader in our content group and firmly rooted both in content strategy as well as content development and writing, and Eric Ungs, who is one of the leaders in our design practice. So welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about some trends. One of the things that really jumped up as we were preparing for today is just this idea that trends don't begin and end in a single year. These things often go on over the course of several years. They evolve, they grow, they change, but they're not clearly contained in one year. And frankly, this year, maybe more than other years, these things connect and intertwine in some different ways. So instead of listing out like 10 or 20 different trends that we're watching for the year, we rolled them up into some themes just because there was so much interconnectedness. And the themes that we're going to be covering today are access to care, user experience, and findability. And we'll get into each of these in turn, starting with access to care. Access is an issue that I think we've talked about at some level for a long time. Certainly, the organizations that we're representing and that we're building web properties for are incredibly complicated organizations. We have internal channel conflict, we have all kinds of issues. And so just having a web property that can simplify what's really going on within our organizations so that a consumer can find the information about the services they need and where the best places for them to get those services is a huge win. And is huge patient access issue. But of course, here in the last year or two, and certainly we see this trend continuing in the future, we also see access issues through digital growing and evolving in some important ways. And some of that is in being able to schedule, so scheduling for new patients, scheduling for existing patients, even some of these, call ahead and put me on the list sorts of things for urgent care and emergency departments, really helping people to connect with care in some different ways. And then in addition to that, now we're also seeing a variety of e-visit options emerging. We're seeing video visits, a lot of other things where care is actually taking place through some of these digital platforms as well. And certainly, I think content and the way that's put together is sort of the core of a lot of these things. What are you thinking about as you think about the access to care issues?
Yeah, Ben, as you mentioned, that one of our jobs on the website is to help simplify the experience for our users. That's a lot of what your content strategy does. So making sure that you're presenting information about all these different care options, the virtual visits, the e-visits, the retail clinics, the urgent care, in a way that makes sense to your users, which isn't necessarily the way that it's organized inside your department. So for example, we recently worked with a client who had information about their urgent care services nested inside of their primary care service line. We did some user testing and we found out that people weren't finding it there because that's not really how patients think of it. That's just how it was organized internally in that organization. So as content strategists, we want to pay attention to those sorts of things and see how we can present it in a way that's really focused on the way that people who are using your website are thinking and making sure it's easy for them to understand all those options. So we've got a great example from one of our clients, Cone Health, of an interior page where they have laid out all their different options for care. We hear from patients that they're confused about all these different options and where to go when. I even recently interviewed a physician who told me that she's a primary care physician. She told me that every time she has a new patient, she wastes like 5 to 10 minutes explaining all these different walk-in care options, which doesn't sound like a lot until you think about the fact that an average doctor visit is like 15 to 20 minutes. So that's a lot of time that doctors are spending trying to educate people about all these great options that their health systems are offering.
Yeah, all these options are great, but it adds confusion.
Exactly.
You need to know more in order to know what to do. Yeah.
Exactly. So as marketers, we can help make that more clear to patients, both those ones that are engaged in our health systems and people who are just, maybe they don't have a PCP, they're trying to figure out where to go, what the best places to go for care, and really lay out in a very clear way what those options are, why you might choose one over the other based on your cost, the age they treat, the wait time, the types of conditions that they treat there. And one thing that's really great about this example too is you can see that they've considered not just the content, but also the way that it's laid out. The visual presentation when we're talking about access to care and helping make that clear to patients is really important.
Yeah, and that's why I love this example for Cone Health, because it beautifully highlights the evolving role design has to play in bringing these kinds of experiences to life. Really, from a design perspective, we are grounded in strategy and data inspired. So when we think about the visual identity or the brand identity, you know, it accentuates that brand's DNA and bringing that brand to life, and it's that initial hook to grab that user's attention and then pull them deeper into that experience. You know, oftentimes when we think or hear of design, it kind of starts and stops at, you know, photography or typography or color, etc. But not only does it have to look great, but it has to be great. And that is truly, you know, design representing the intersection of all these various disciplines, whether it's content, strategy, digital, data, insights, etc., to really create something strategically and emotively on point to kind of support really the overall goal of this is providing convenience and ease of use. And that's why I love this example is, you know, that approach and that framework we took was, you know, very much through a strategic lens and looking at research, user testing to validate the hypothesis before going to market, while at the same time ensuring the visual identity truly represents the brand experience both online and offline.
Another thing you'll notice in this example is the use of really clear calls to action here and those online services that you were talking about, Ben, where reserve your spot is an action that your user can take online. Get directions, again, is an action that your user can take online to make sure that they're getting to the place that they need to go. Another thing that we see with all these care options is the importance of making sure that you're helping users connect no matter where they're landing on your website. So I think we're going to talk a little bit later about some findability and where people are landing when they come to your website. But if they're Googling, say, urgent care, and we've got an example of an urgent care page here, we want to make sure that they're learning not just about the urgent care services that they've heard about, but also understanding those other care options that your health system offers. So this is an example from Essentia Health in Duluth. They're based in Duluth. They cover a much wider area than that. You can see they've built out this great section about their different walk-in services, and then have added a panel here highlighting e-visits. This might not be as familiar to their users, but they want to make sure that they're using their website to really help users make those connections that they might not otherwise make. And as we were talking about Cone Health and the intersection of design and content, this is another great example. This is their homepage. The one we shared earlier was an interior page. When we worked with Cone Health to redesign their website last year, one thing they told us was they know people are coming to the site trying to figure out where to go to learn about these different care options, and they wanted to use that space on the homepage, the first thing you see when you open up the website, to help guide them to the right places to go. And we're seeing a lot more of this type of request from different health systems that we work with, using that homepage space not just for an image, but to really make it usable to help users accomplish their goals.
Yeah, and I think this demonstrates it's really about getting good at getting people what they need when they need it. And this is the front door in terms of identifying what those care options are and giving them an opportunity to kind of compare, but also just getting them in the path at the get-go, so they're on the so they have the right experience out of the gates.
Yeah. Well, and certainly, you know, experiences is our next big trend too. So this has been, I think, something that's emerged and moved much more to the front. It's always something that we've looked at, you know, on a list of different considerations. But when we've looked at what's going on our website, oftentimes we've been very focused on a moment in time, right? The moment in time when people are making decisions about care and making sure that we have got the information, we're putting it in front of people to explain, that we do that service and why we're the best option to do that service. And that moment of decision is still critically important, but we're seeing this big expansion to really engage with consumers outside of that moment of decision, to help engage them earlier in the process, to build relationships, to educate, hopefully, work in a way that when it comes time to make the decision, they're not really shopping options in maybe the same way that they would have if they didn't already have a relationship, and certainly to support people beyond that moment of initial decision into all the different things that come with the care that they're receiving or the experience they have with their disease or condition or injury or whatever it may be. And doing that, of course, requires us to understand our patients and consumers in different ways. So we're seeing a lot more work in user research and persona development and journey maps and some of those kinds of things as a way to align the things that we're doing digitally with the experience that people are having, so we can help support them wherever it is that they choose to engage with us. For some of our clients that are sort of on the forefront of this, we're even having a lot of conversations around how the digital experience syncs up with what people get in the real world, or what they're seeing on the website, and how is that consistent with what other digital outposts out there may have for them. And so experience is really taking a different kind of role, and we're thinking about it in a lot of different ways today that maybe we did in the past.
Yep. I think in healthcare we will really start to see and putting a larger emphasis on looking externally to kind of drive those customer experiences, rather than solely only trying to solve them looking internally. I think when we shift the mindset to trying to solve human problems first, I think indirectly we end up solving the business problem. And if we click through to the kind of these images are beautiful to kind of depict that, right? On the left we have this beautifully paved pathway, beautifully designed, it looks great, but at the end of the day, it's not how users are actually using that space. They actually identified and created their own space. And then we have on the right, which is the Ohio State University campus. On the right, on the top, and they took a totally different approach. Instead of just going full on, hey, we want to instill this beautiful pathway in this green space, it's let's do nothing and just simply observe how students are getting from point A to point B, and let that surface up any kind of trending pattern. And then from there, provide the design that pedestrians or students will actually use. And I think that this beautifully portrays the whole notion around user experience, people first design. One thing I wanted to kind of highlight in terms of user experiences around inclusivity. When we think about inclusive design, it really is meant to please a diverse range of individuals and providing a variety of ways to experience that same experience. It's people first design. And when we think about inclusivity, one of the main goals for that is web accessibility. And to summarize that, web accessibility is simply designing and coding a website that's approachable, navigable, and useful for those with disabilities. We heard a ton about this the last few years. I got a lot of attention, but I think as you alluded to in terms of trends come and go, I think we look at this as a trend that's here to stay. We see it as a necessity. It's essential that accessibility drives the design process. It drives the content development process to be inclusive, not only in the majority but also the minority. And for two really primary reasons. One is around the blatant black and white reason, right? It's from a legal perspective to remain compliant with WCAG standards. But I think the second reason, and most importantly, is it's simply the right thing to do when we're putting people first, when we're putting patients first. So when we focus on the needs of a narrow segment market of the 20% who have disabilities, what we're ultimately creating is a more broadly useful digital experience. Also, when we're solving kind of for those points of exclusion for the 20%, we're also creating opportunities, alternative opportunities for the 80%. Just a very simple example of that is an individual who is hard of hearing and they want to see a video, right? Watch a video, hear a video. from an accessibility standpoint, we will have closed caption on that, right? So it's very beneficial and valuable for that individual with disabilities. But someone who is not hard of hearing, but might be in a situation or a challenging experience where they can't necessarily hear the video, but the closed caption is still of value to them. So, accessibility has to be the foundation of how we approach redesigns, how we approach implementations, to include as many people as we can, so that we're not just focusing on the majority, but we're also inclusive of the minority.
And not just closed captioning, but also a transcript, right?
Right.
Which,
Yep.
Again, helps people in other scenarios, but has the added value of making that video searchable in
Yep.
a way that video or audio files normally aren't.
Yeah, there's multiple ways to view and hear that video for sure.
Yeah.
And I think, so obviously, I agree kind of the moral, ethical reasoning behind it is probably number one, or is number one, in the legal guidelines and things. But even outside of that, even if you're just thinking selfishly as, an organization owner or president, 20% of the population having a disability, that's a 20% market share that maybe your competition's not exactly targeting, or at least not targeting effectively or efficiently. So it could be the difference between if your site, has really good tab stops, and your site, the screen readers react really well to, you have good imaging with alt tags and things like that, and it's really responsive to those people. That might be the difference maker between them choosing you over a competitor. Yep. Or a competitor over you, if they're the ones that are really taking control over that.
So accessibility, one big driver of user experience work. Like, what are some of the other things that are kind of moving us along from a user experience perspective, or that are pushing us in different directions?
You mentioned some of the tools that we use, Ben, like personas, patient journey maps, that really help us as healthcare marketers step outside our own space and understand what the experience is like for the user. So it's hard when we're in healthcare and we're hearing the medical jargon every day, and we understand the internal politics or departmental structures. Sometimes it's hard to step out of that and put ourselves in the minds of a person who's not familiar with healthcare and who's facing maybe a crisis situation. So we have tools like that help us step out of our own perspective and create a strategy that's really based on the information that our users need in the format, the time, and the place that they need it. So we can use those tools to implement the strategy, and then we have more tools that we can use to test to see if it's working the way that we hypothesized it would. So there's an increasing interest, I think, in user testing, and I know Tim has done quite a bit of that work with some different methods.
Yeah, so like Ann said, making sure that you have some of that data up front, and you make some of those assumptions you have to make and have that hypothesis, but it's crucial to not only test it afterwards, but to begin to iterate on that. You're never done. You're never done with anything, and so we can do things that are as in depth as in-person user testing, where we might have people physically in front of a computer with somebody behind them giving them kind of tasks to complete, and we see how they complete those tasks and what they feel is the most intuitive route to take to get from A to Z, and all the way down maybe to something a little less cost prohibitive or even time prohibitive, to having just a simple poll or survey on your website that you put maybe at the end of that journey or somewhere in the middle that says, how are things going? Are you finding what you're looking for? How can we make things easier? Give us that feedback and let us pick. And I think it kind of ties back to the image of the Ohio State University with the oval there. So they did that. They opted not to make those assumptions up front, and they let people show them. And there's this difference between the user path that you define and the desire path that your users actually take. And I think one of the big components of user experience, and where the testing and all the things that are being talked about come into play, is just kind of getting out of their way a little bit. So you might want somebody to go from your home page to cancer treatment service line page, and so you put your navigation there and you're like, well, we're done. Like, now they can get there to there. And then you run some testing and it's like, oh wow, they're going from the home page to some Content Hub article over to maybe a physician profile, and then they're getting to a service line page. And so if you're not taking that entire holistic journey into view and having that into that perspective, you're never going to pave that path as nicely. So you're going to have that one sidewalk that goes homepage to service line, and then all your people there on the left are taking that journey a completely different way on your website. And so that testing allows you to really get genuine insight around what your users are doing, as opposed to maybe what you anecdotally think they should do or what you think they will do. So yeah, making sure that you're running some kind of testing, even if it's just analyzing the data, setting up some tracking along your website to see, are people using our navigational elements? What are their referral paths? What's that journey look like? And then really finding a way to not just nudge them to the path you've predefined, but find a way to make the path what they've predefined.
Yeah, well, and I see so many more tools, so many more options. Like there are less barriers to going out and gathering data and testing things ahead of time, but those things don't replace actually watching what happens when you put this out in the wild, right? Real users with real scenarios that don't have someone asking a question a particular way over their shoulder are gonna go about processing these things differently, and they're just approaching problems differently, and you have to be cognizant of that, and you have to continue to adapt the experience basically.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the best websites are using tools on both sides. They're using tools to figure out the best way to approach the website and make the best plan they can, and then test it and make small adjustments moving forward once it gets out into the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be ready to kind of react and respond to the way things go. Even if you do some really intensive testing, you know, the way that your market is utilizing your website today doesn't mean they're going to use it that way tomorrow. And so continuing to evolve that process and develop some kind of, you know, fluid strategy around that. You know, we know with some kind of consistency, we're going to go out and run that same type of assessment, or we're going to run some more testing every 6 months or so to make sure that we're staying on top of what our users want and how they're looking for things. And as we get into the findability section and things like that, and we learn more that people with different intent are landing on different pages, that experience is going to be drastically different for some people. So making sure, similar to accessibility, and here's that interconnectivity Ben was talking about, making sure that, you know, you're trying to take care of as many people as possible. And that goes from the accessibility to the experience. And Anne mentioned, you know, having, I don't remember what the urgent care kind of nested within a different section and people weren't looking for it there. That's kind of what this is all about, understanding that that's not where they're looking for it, and then putting it where they are looking for it, and just making that experience, you know, having that synergy and cohesion throughout that entire experience.
And when we think about the core experience for large groups, you know, mobile is something that we used to talk about a lot because the numbers were exploding. We don't talk about it quite as much now because I think it's sort of assumed, but those numbers are continuing to grow, aren't they? Like, and how does that play into how we're designing these experiences?
Yeah, you know, I think I don't think we can. It's no longer good enough to just simply have a responsive site. You know, especially when we think about just the sheer, as you said, the sheer volume of mobile. Mobile is at the core of our digital lives. Like that's the thing that connects us to all the fragmented experiences that, you know, consumers, patients have. So when we think about mobile, you know, I think we're going to be getting to a place where we're going to have to start solving for mobile first, and then expanding outward to the larger viewpoints. You know, what I love about that is it really forces us as marketers, as content writers, as designers to focus. You know, really focusing on what's most important for that user at that point in time. You know, it's almost like a less is more approach, and it's not so much getting rid of everything, but it's more around, hey, what are the essentials? What are the things that we need to add here that are going to provide the most value? So absolutely, it's mobile is definitely at the core of our digital lives, and it's important that we focus that intention there and really drive that experience, knowing that we can expand outward.
We talked a little bit already about the fact that very often people aren't engaging through the homepage, but I think that's a sort of a nice lead in to this our next theme, which is, you know, findability. That for many organizations, the, you know, homepage of their site is as much Google as it is the homepage of their site. We did a webinar last year with the title somewhere along those lines. But you know, Google continues to be, well, in all the search engines, but Google is certainly the dominant force. Continues to be a huge driver. It drives a lot of strategy about how we're organizing things and setting things up. But at the same time that it's critically important to the traffic that's coming to us, it feels like there's greater tension in there, that Google is trying to hold on to more traffic. it's kind of making the shift from being the card catalog for the internet to being the encyclopedia, where you look up and get the short form answer to whatever the question is that you're doing in your high school essay. And that shift, I think, is not without its problems, right? I think we've seen it maybe a little less in healthcare than in music or in some other spaces where it's really hard to get off of a Google property once you've started searching for those things on Google. There's still a lot of engagement there, but the strategies that we need to work properly with Google have really changed a lot in the last couple of years, haven't they?
Yeah, and it's interesting changing the last couple of years. So kind of backpedaling to what Eric was saying about mobile. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that you built a desktop site and a mobile site, and then you made mobile responsive, and now so these shifts can happen super fast. I mean, they and these big dramatic shifts. So on the findability side, Google updates their algorithm once every 9 minutes. Not every algorithm update is massive, but it's still there's the changes happening so drastically and so frequently that sometimes you don't have a choice but to be reactive. But that relationship is changing, largely. So in 2019, Google reported that 64% of all Google searches were what they define as zero-click searches, which means, as Ben was saying, that the user never actually leaves that search engine result page. And then what's also interesting is of the remaining clicks, 12% go to another property owned by Google. So they're going to YouTube, they're going to Gmail, they're going to Maps. So even though they leave the search engine result page, they're not leaving for your page. And I think the gut reaction there is that, so like websites are dying and SEO is dying, but the traffic that's remaining is still millions and millions and millions of users. So that's still critically important, and if not even more important, because a lot of the things that play into why those zero-click searches exist are coming from your website. So those, the featured snippets and having the map pack and those sort of things, those are getting fueled and even oftentimes provided from your website. So that's still a very critical aspect, but it has kind of shifted the way that we approach SEO from just having those traditional 3 pillars, that technical, on-page and off-page. And we have a few blogs out that kind of go through those, but it's kind of, we're seeing the emergence of this 4th pillar, which we're referring to as on SERP, or on search engine result page SEO. And that's basically our response to how Google is kind of treating this. And I think you said frenemy, and I think it's a great explanation of how that relationship is working right now, because ultimately all traffic, or I guess the vast majority of traffic, is Google's traffic, and you kind of borrow it to your website. And so it's shifted the way we think about things and how we can optimize Google instead of just optimizing our website. And so I think we have a slide. Yeah. So an example of one of those pages, this doesn't even have all the different features that are available that I'm sure you all have seen, but you can see that real estate is just shifting dramatically when you do these searches. So if somebody is searching for something specific, you have a lot more opportunities to get in front of them. So on the side there, you can kind of see that featured call out. You've got ads there. You'll typically see some maps. So you have more opportunities, but at the same time, if you're not taking advantage of those opportunities and you're not, optimizing Google for your organization, there's more opportunities to miss out as well.
So if anyone I think the on SERP SEO might be a new concept to some folks. Yeah. So can you dig a little deeper and just what you mean when you're using that phrase?
Yeah, so on SERP SEO, so when the other 3 pillars, so technical SEO is making sure that your website is able to be indexed by the search engines. So making sure that you're set up in a way where it's possible to index you. And then on-page SEO is making sure that you have somebody like Anne who can guide you through making Google want to index your page. And then off-page SEO is traditionally related to backlinks and things like that. And so that's the rest of the internet saying, you guys should check out this website. And so those things have always kind of been there. And so we're used to optimizing for those. We've kind of got a handle on what Google's looking for those things. But as that zero-click continues to grow and people are just staying on Google, that's where that on SERP, that on search engine results page comes into play, because now we have to figure out how we can also answer those queries right on the results page. So if we're assuming that 64% of people aren't ever going to make it to our website, how do we still convert them? How do we still get in front of them? And how do we still make that content that we want to deliver to them digestible and available? And so these different features that they provide are opportunity to do that. And so as things like voice search maybe happen at some point in the future, the things that get read back and the things that people are engaging with and the way that people are consuming that information just continue to shift. And so we now have to add that into our strategy and figure out, similar to accessibility, you can't ignore that 20% of the population that has a disability. With SEO, you can't ignore that 64% of people that aren't going to come to your website.
And this is another place where those patient journey maps that we were talking about a little earlier can be really helpful. There are some things that you know your patients are going to pick up from these no-click searches, right? Like a phone number, or here we've got number of employees, like these quick hits of information. There's other things that your patients are really going to need to click through to your website to find.
Right.
And that's where having good content development is really going to impact your search results. Make sure that you're answering users' questions, you're offering high quality content of high value, and Google's going to rank you well on their pages, because their main goal is, when they're not trying to keep people on their properties, their main goal is to connect people with the answers they're looking for on those other sites.
Yeah, and it's I mean, as we talked on the design side about shifting to the mobile first approach, on the search engine result on this SEO side, we're seeing similar shifts there as well. So it used to be, you typed in a query and Google basically just searched the websites for that string of words and like, these exist here, so this might be what you're looking for. As that kind of AI and that machine learning continues to evolve into the Terminator era, we start to see Google actually understanding intent behind that query. So content strategy is incredibly important to understand. If I'm searching for a podiatrist, I'm probably looking for an actual person and not necessarily
probably one near me. I probably don't care about podiatrists anywhere in the world, right?
And yeah, one near me. And Google's kind of understanding that podiatrist and pediatrics and the way people type things is actually important, and it kind of dictates what they're really looking for, and they're getting really advanced in being able to deliver that. And so having that content and understanding the user journey mapping and those personas to say that this kind of person, this audience is looking for this source or this sort of information, and having that available, and then allowing Google to kind of take that and serve it up. And so we're seeing maybe some sections built out into multiple pages. You can't just have one page about cancer care now, because there's so many different places in that funnel where people are going to come in, depending on where they're at, just got diagnosed all the way to currently undergoing treatment, and they need different information. And Google is going to serve up whatever site out there is more fine-tuned and tailored to that specific audience. So these things, the SEO, the on-page SEO, the content strategy is not going anywhere. And then making sure that not only are you available with that information, but then, if they're presumably on mobile, that once they get there, it's now presented in a way they can, really digest that.
That was one of the big revelations for me. Like, when we looked at, keywords and the way people are searching for things and stuff like that, we used to talk about it in terms of, well, different people think about the issue in different ways or search for it in different ways. And it's become more evident that that's true, but also that people are at different points in their journey, and therefore they're looking for different things because they might be concerned, or they might have just been diagnosed and they're looking for more information, or they might be looking for a second opinion, or they might be looking for treatment, or they might be looking for rehab, or they're in different places. They need different things, and the searches that they have reflect where they are in that journey. And again, like for the areas where you're going to go deep, you need to meet them at each point in the journey, and not just at a point in the journey.
And it's going to start getting more complex. Google is in the process of what they refer to as page diversity. And it's part of this big initiative, as always, to kind of answer the user experience, which is ultimately Google's biggest goal. And what that's going to end up doing is, for any search, you're only eligible on the first page to have one result. And so one of the things that even outside of healthcare we've been falling back on for so long is if I have, a few pages about cancer care, I don't necessarily need to optimize them for the specific audiences, because if somebody searches for cancer care, I might have 2, 3, 4, listings organically on that page, and they can find the one that's best for them. Well, Google is going to say no more to that, and you only have one opportunity. And so now it's super important, because that's your one chance to really appeal to that user and say, like, this is what you're looking for. So I know where you're at in that journey and in that funnel, and click through to my website. And so if you miss out on that one opportunity, you miss out on that traffic. And when you start kind of compiling those things like 0 clicks, and now like you only have one chance, like, I mean, it's incredibly stressful and very crucial to make sure that you're at the right place, the right time with the right information.
Well, that shift, along with, you mentioned the emphasis on local,
Right.
especially with healthcare, has a big impact in how we are strategizing the website and the content we're writing, especially when it comes to like your clinic or hospital locations. And I know that's been a trend with design too.
Yeah, the one stat I like to refer to on that is, 63% of local searches are made by people undecided. So it's just critically important that we spend as much time on these location profiles as we would on the homepage, assuming that that's the front door. The reality is these location profiles are more than just that profile. It's oftentimes the front door to just understanding and getting a first impression on your brand. So to kind of, summarize all that up, it's again getting good at getting people the right information at the right time, and especially with on these location pages, it's really pulling out that brand's unique point of difference, especially when people potentially are undecided on that page.
Yeah, I think as far as findability goes, I'm mostly talking about the organic side, but it's understanding, like you said, where that entry point really is, and what that specific user in that case, in that kind of micro moment, what it is they're looking for. And one of the ways that we can kind of accomplish that is also with paid advertising, which we typically use to kind of supplement the organic efforts. And so we had a campaign that we ran for Olmsted Medical, and they're right across the street from Mayo. And so obviously everybody knows who Mayo is, and Mayo has this outstanding reputation and, does really amazing things. And they also have an emergency room like a hospital would. And so people were waiting in this emergency room for hours and hours and hours, and sometimes over days. And so Olmsted wanted a way to get in front of people and let them know that you can also get really amazing care here, and you don't have to wait a day in the ER to do that. So we ran some advertising and really geo-fenced in Mayo's ER, so people that were physically sitting in their waiting room would see. Sorry, Mayo, you guys are still cool. So people would see this ad and see, get treated, not seated, with their kind of average ER wait times, and just let people know. And so I think this touches on all three of them. Maybe waiting that long is a poor user experience for them offline, and they don't know that they have access to care much quicker. And then this allows them to find that. And so just making sure that you understand, not just what your users are looking for, but how your competition is approaching that same problem, and understanding kind of the gap analysis and, where you have those areas of opportunity. And so Olmsted, they knew an area of opportunity for them was having much shorter wait times. And so they took advantage, and it worked out super well.
Yeah, experience is becoming a competitive differentiator.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. We're starting to get a bunch of questions in. So if you have questions, do enter them in the Q&A field. A couple of closing thoughts just before we get into the Q&A. Listening to kind of the conversation, obviously we've got these three big trends. If there's some things I was going to pull out of, like, how we see organizations adapting to that, like, it's interesting to know, like, what's happening, but what do you do with that? It seems like the focus on being patient or consumer centered it's really sort of non-negotiable now. This realm where sometimes you can get away with having a brand presence or a website that was reflective of the internal structure of the organization. We're really beyond that, and that becomes sort of a non-competitive place to be. I think certainly I'm hearing a lot about the ability to use data to drive decisions, more tools, easier tools, cheaper tools, both before sites go live or new features go live or changes go live, as well as to watch what's going on once you put those things out in the wild, test different hypotheses on how the experience can change, adapt things, personalize things. We can talk a lot about personalization, but certainly I think that's one of the inevitable kind of outcomes of some of these pieces. And then just frankly, the fact that you have to stay on your toes, right? Strategies shift, strategies are shifting. In some of these areas like search, I feel like the pace of change today is like Google's never stopped changing, right? You know, the search engines, the search, space has never stopped changing. The pace of change right now is faster than I think it's certainly been in a long time, maybe ever. Just the number of things that are changing, the speed of those changes, those sorts of things. The things that were best practice for your site, for your strategy, for your content, for the way you social, all these things a couple of years ago are probably not the right strategies today. So you really have to take a strategy at a moment in time. You need to be able to run with those things when you get them, and you need to keep assessing. Because the thing that's going to be most effective 2 years or 3 years from now is probably not the thing that's going to be best practice today either. So great insight, great thoughts. We are open to questions, and again, push those questions through. Since you can see us on video instead of me having this up here, those of you who have stuck with us, is it okay for me to okay, I've got the go ahead from marketing. We're allowed to share how you get the free homepage user experience assessment. We're testing new things to see if this helps keep people all the way through to the end. You can go out to gnectric.com/UX-assessment, and that's where you can sign up to get a free homepage user experience assessment. We'll keep this up during the Q&A here. And we've gotten a couple of different questions here. And I guess we'll start off with, there was a question that came in as you were talking about mobile first design. And the question's really about the cheeseburger, the little 3 lines. I call it the cheeseburger.
The cheeseburger versus the hamburger. Yeah. Whatever you want on your hamburger.
I used to call it the triple cheeseburger, but like someone's like, no, like those are buns. I don't know, whatever you call that thing. It's become, I think it's become the go-to. It's become a normal UX element. And apps and in responsive sites when the screens are small, we're starting to see that happen, that being used with these mobile first design approaches when the screen gets relatively large. Wondering how you feel about that as an approach as a strategy.
Yeah.
What's the data telling us?
With the cheeseburger menu icon, it's obviously ubiquitous on mobile, right? It's extremely recognizable. It's the navigation icon on mobile. But when we get to the desktop view, it's kind of one of those things where content strategists and designers love to hate. Even though it's very recognizable, even though it provides an opportunity to kind of clean up the header, and it provides a kind of a secondary access point. At the same time, the data does say that, it has tremendously low engagement. And then ultimately with that low engagement, it makes those pages just less important or less valuable. But it's still one of those things, and we talk about testing. There's not always a black and white answer. There's always going to be gray. There may be opportunities where we can stuff some tertiary actions behind there to kind of add some breathing room to the main navigation. Never putting the primary navigation out there, but if there's an opportunity to provide some breathing room to further emphasize the primary navigation, I think there's an opportunity to not just go into it with 100% of traffic, but an opportunity for some A/B testing, kind of clearly see how your users are behaving with it. But again, it's not a black and white thing, but I think it's universal from the content strategist perspective and designer. That's probably one of the things that we just love to hate.
Yeah, and I love that answer because certainly designers are opinionated. I think that's a good blanket, statement that I can make, and it applies to a great many designers. But it's not about liking or not liking the element. Right. It's about, does it work when you put it out in the wild and you test it and you see what the data that comes back really looks like. And the answer is it's kind of challenging. You wouldn't use it on a desktop site the way you would on a mobile site where that's probably the place where you're keeping your primary nav.
Yep.
All right. Good, or bad. Is it good? And a question that probably you're best suited to respond to here. We talked a lot about user experience, and you talked a little bit about sort of the role of content there, but can you maybe go a little bit deeper on the role of content in user experience?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more interest in and attention to the voice and tone of content and the impact that that has on your user experience, as well as accessibility and inclusivity components of content. So a lot of times when we think accessibility, we think about physically using the website, physically navigating the website. But there's a text element to that too. And that includes writing in a way that is understandable to your readers, taking out some of that medical jargon or explaining it in a way that's really easy for people to understand. We recommend using plain language. About 9 in 10 adults in the United States struggle to understand and use health information when it's unfamiliar, or it's really complex, or they're faced with a serious diagnosis, or it's just filled with a lot of medical jargon. So being really thoughtful.
And the other 1 in 10 works in health.
I think that is a true stat, yeah. So you can see how important it is to be very clear with your content. We have also seen research that shows that the voice and tone of your content really has a big impact of your audience's perception of your brand. So when you have a more formal, more matter-of-fact tone, you might conventionally think, hey, that's going to make me sound more impressive, right? But it turns out that research has shown that users prefer a tone that's friendlier, more conversational, more the kind of voice they would get if they were actually in the doors of your organization talking to one of your doctors or talking to one of your nurses. When they read content like that, they're more likely to rate your hospital or your healthcare system as trustworthy and friendly, and also as more desirable, more likely to be a place they would recommend to their friends.
Fantastic. So we got another question. I think it's directed at you, Tim, because you made a funny face when you mentioned voice search earlier. So, voice search is a topic that gets a lot of play out there. And there's a lot of angst, I think, about it. And there's very little sort of meaningful guidance on what one should do with this growing trend. So how do you feel about voice search? And, what kind of guidance are you giving to our clients about what they should be doing differently because of the emergence of voice search?
Okay.
Deep breath.
I was recently on a panel, and the last question we were asked was, what do you think is the biggest trend in the coming year? So this was late last year. And what do you think is the most overrated thing in digital marketing? The panelist right by me said the biggest thing coming was voice search, and the thing that I said was most overrated was voice search. So there's kind of 2 schools of thought. I'm not saying I'm right, but I am. And so voice search is one of those things where I do think it will pick up in healthcare. It is wildly misunderstood between voice search and voice assistance. Voice assistance is used pretty widely in healthcare. That's things like, what's an urgent care near me that's open now? That sort of thing is, using a voice assistant like Siri or something like that to deliver up that information. Voice search is a little bit more in depth, that there isn't data to support that taking off in healthcare or other industries at this time, but there are things you can do to optimize kind of that on-SERP SEO now that if and when voice search does take off, will play directly into that. So having, being optimized for those featured snippets, having schema on your website, which Google kind of uses like a Rolodex to have information about, locations and providers and different services on your website, having those sort of things where you get to be that featured result on the page. That's currently what is being read by voice search. And so as that continues to take off, you get the benefit now of that real estate I was talking about on the search result page, and having kind of the first say in whatever the answer to that query is. But then when voice search comes in, you're also there already. So you don't have to wait to see the results from that kind of SEO investment. Although if you're defining your strategy around SEO around voice search, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for people to do. One of the ways that we try to iterate on this stuff, and we talk about testing and talk about using that data and shifting our approach. It's really hard to do with voice search because there isn't a way to get that data at this time. And so since we talk mostly about Google just because of the market share they have, if you're familiar with Google Search Console, they add things in there constantly, different ways you can parse that data. You can now see which of those kind of featured snippets and which of those new cool features that you're already being featured in and for which queries and things like that. And so I use Search Console as kind of my peek into what Google's focus is, because they update it so frequently and they add things, and there's no way in there to parse out or segment by voice. And so from my perspective, if Google hasn't made a way to even see that data yet, they must not either have much data or they must not be putting a lot of stock in the actual voice search aspect of it quite yet. And so once we start seeing even just a filter in there that has voice search included, I think that's your kind of go time. But if you're already optimizing for those featured snippets and just the way you should be optimizing your website anyways, having that great content, which I think is, the cornerstone of all SEO is that great content. If you're already doing that and you're getting those featured, if voice search happens, if it happens, you're going to be ready by default.
And I agree that fighting for the snippet is probably a losing battle. And frankly, even when you get the snippet, I'm not sure that that translates into business in a meaningful way. If people across the U.S. see your one paragraph answer to what is X.
Yeah, it's very like service line specific, as most of the things are. So, urgent care, I think as a service line, you want to have a really big emphasis on like Google My Business, because most people that are looking for urgent care have a much different intent, and it's more of that micro moment. And so they're willing to take action like right now, hence urgent care. But if it's something like cancer care that's going to involve more research, I don't think that one paragraph there is going to move the needle on the ROI. But it's nice to still be first.
It does feel like the kinds of searches that we're seeing across the board are changing. And I think maybe voice is a piece of kind of the mental shift there, right? It felt like people used to just dump a bunch of keywords in, and now it seems like I see complete questions, complete thoughts. And I don't know if that's just a voice search thing, but I think it must have an impact on the way we think about SEO or the way that we maybe do some elements of our content strategy.
Yeah, I think searches are definitely getting more conversational. They used to be really long tail years ago, but like you said, it was more just like keyword, 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 and it wasn't really cohesive or coherent. And then they just got like really short, and people were like, know what I'm thinking with 2 words. And now it is moving more conversational and long tail again. And I know we talked about local before, and those near me searches, which are actually growing more and more irrelevant as Google's technology grows and they know what you had for breakfast and where you're at.
You don't have to say near me. I'm not sure the concept of near me becomes less relevant, but
you don't necessarily have to type it, but oddly enough in the data, it's being typed more. So people are using it more, even though it's needed less. But they're getting more conversational. And, until we have a way to segment that data, I don't know if that's because people are using the voice search or if it's, people do use the voice assistants. And I know a lot of people out there use like voice to text. And so maybe that's just now how they're used to, so they even type it. I don't use any of, I have Alexa and all that stuff at home. And I use that sort of things, but I don't use it as much as a lot of people my age do. And I still type conversationally into searches. It's still more long tail.
And I'm curious, like as people are asking questions instead of keyword stuffing in their searches, like is that changing the way you're thinking about the kinds of content that we need to have on our sites or how we organize it, or like what's the impact there?
It gives us really great insight into the information people are looking for, and in a more specialized way, right? Those kind of niche things that they care about, which can be really helpful when you're doing, say, content marketing efforts and trying to figure out where can I write an article about this broad topic? How can I focus it in a smaller way? How can I take a little piece of that for this month and a little piece of it for next month? And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about that next month in our webinar about content marketing.
And with that, thank you for attending today's webinar.